I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at theDove.us.
Welcome to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and what a delight to have back with us today Dr. Richard Land. He's the president of the Southern Evangelical Seminary, and they host one of the great apologetic conferences coming up. And you may want to write this down, ses.edu. That's the website, ses.edu. It stands for Southern Evangelical Seminary.edu. And Dr. Land, again, thank you, sir. We get great comments when you're on, so good to see you again. How are you, my friend?
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
First of all, the conference coming up. Give us the headline on that.
Well, the theme is ideas have consequences. The bigger the idea, the bigger the consequence. And we're going to be talking about those ideas, about moral relativism versus moral absolutes, about intelligent design versus evolution. We got Hugh Ross coming to speak. Josh McDowell is going to be speaking for us. We're going to have a stellar lineup. Dr. Norm Geisler, our co-founder, will be speaking. I'm really excited about it. It's going to be a great conference. We're going to do a symposium on same-sex marriage and where we go from here and why it matters in American society, and what are the best ways for Christians to defend traditional marriage and also to defend religious freedom.
All right, and that's coming up when?
October 16th and 17th.
All right, and let me again encourage our viewers and listeners, go to ses.edu, ses.edu, and you can register there and get all the information. Well, Dr. Land, World Magazine came out with a very interesting survey, and give us your take on that.
Well, I was very encouraged by it. In full disclosure, I was one of the people that was part of the survey, but I was very encouraged when the results came out that at least among evangelical leaders, they are still very concerned about the so-called social issues in the election coming up in 2016, and where the candidates stand on things like the sanctity of life, from conception to natural death and everywhere in between. And also, I was very pleased to see that the number one concern was religious freedom in the United States, because that shows that evangelical leaders understand the threats that are coming at us as evangelical Christians concerning our religious freedom here in the United States. The struggle for religious freedom and the right to practice what you believe rather than to just believe it is really the front line. And we certainly want candidates running for office who understand it and who are willing to stand up and defend religious freedom, which is our constitutional guarantee and we believe our God-given right.
Well, that's encouraging. That is very encouraging. For the most part, evangelicals sat out in 08 and 012. Do you think now we're waking up the importance of not only voting, those of us who are registered, but even those who are eligible to register and vote?
Well, I certainly hope so. I don't see how you can have any kind of legitimate excuse for not being registered to vote, not being an informed voter, and not voting, and not only in the general election, but in the primary, because we have some excellent candidates running for national office. We have some excellent candidates running in most places for regional, state, and local offices. And we have to make our voices heard. I believe that if you look at Romans 13, where it says that we are to support the civil magistrate for conscience sake, that includes not only paying your taxes, but it includes voting.
If religious freedom was one of the top issues that came out of that survey, followed by the sanctity of life, do you think now, in light of what's happened with Planned Parenthood and these videos, that the evangelicals in this country, the faith community, will put pressure on Congress to do something about it? Because we lost the vote in the Senate, and I don't know if we can put pressure to bring it back.
Well, you know, we lost the vote, but we did get a majority. I do think that Planned Parenthood has taken a major hit. The polls show now that by 58 to 38%, that the American public want Planned Parenthood to be defunded. I am hopeful that these grotesque videos, these hideous images, will tear the mask off of the true nature of what goes on in abortion clinics, and that it will become the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the pro-life movement. You know, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 1850s. It became fabulously popular in the North, and it is credited with galvanizing anti-slavery sentiment because it put a human face on the suffering of those who are being held in human bondage. And Abraham Lincoln credited Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, with actually leading to his election. And when he finally met her, he said, "I'm glad to finally meet the woman who wrote the book that started the war." Well, I believe that these Planned Parenthood videos are putting a human face not only on the tiniest citizens who are being rent asunder and dissected in order to sell their body parts and their organs, but also on the cold, emotionless the ways in which Planned Parenthood doctors are talking about human beings. I think this has profoundly shocked America. And if it didn't, then we're in worse shape than I thought we were.
All right, I want to kind of unpack that part of it a little bit, because as evil as this is, have we grown an immunity to evil? Not only as it relates to Planned Parenthood, but ISIS.
You can't allow 57 million American babies to be aborted without desensitizing your culture to moral values and to the sanctity of human life. It's just not possible. And so I think that we have been, to a certain degree, desensitized. But I also think that the abortion movement has done a very good job of hiding what they do under euphemisms of the fetus. And they don't talk about the fact that these are human beings, and they never refer to abortive mothers as mothers. And they have done a fantastic job from a public relations perspective, aided and abetted by a news media that is overwhelmingly pro-choice in their own personal value system. But these videos are shocking people. Even I know people who are pro-choice who are shocked by this. And some of them are reevaluating whether or not they should be pro-choice, based upon having seen these videos and the undeniable fact that these are human beings with developed nervous systems, which means that when they are being aborted and they are being rent asunder and they are being dissected, that they feel pain, and they're not being given any painkiller. And the cold and callous way in which the Planned Parenthood employees and doctors are discussing these human beings and looking upon them as an assembly line for organs and for body parts, I think has profoundly shocked most Americans who are not pro-life, who have been have sort of taken the opportunity to look the other way and to not know what was going on. I was reminded as I watched the last one of what Wilberforce said when he gave his great speech on the floor of the Parliament in England against the slave trade, and he laid out the horrors of the slave trade right there in the House of Commons. And he concluded by saying, you may choose to do nothing. You may choose to continue the slave trade. But from this day forward, you can never say again, I didn't know what was going on.
All right. It appears to me, Dr. Lamb, that with all of the fight that we've been going on to save the life of the unborn all of these years since 1973, that God has given us the unbelievable opportunity through these videos to do something. I still think that it'll be predicated upon whether or not pastors now will seize this moment and go before their congregations and preach on life. But some of it still see it as political. What would you say to them?
Well, I would say to them that the Bible is very clear. I think it is almost blasphemous to try to argue that God is a Republican or a Democrat. You cannot in any way, shape, or form reduce God to a political party. But God is pro-life, and he's pro-life from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible. There's a reason why alone among all the civilizations in the Mediterranean basin, the Jews did not practice infanticide, and the Jews did not practice abortion. Everybody else did. The Romans did, the Greeks did, the Egyptians did, the Assyrians did, the Chaldeans did, the Phoenicians did it, the Babylonians did it. The Jews didn't do it. Why? Because their God, who is the one true God, had made it very clear to them from the beginning that human life is sacred and that life begins at conception. And that's not a statement of faith, that's a statement of scientific fact. We now know from science that life begins at conception. The sperm enters the egg, and the unique person that each of us is begins. And that's determined by God. He knits us and embroiders us together in our mother's womb, and all of our parts are written in God's book before any of them came to be. And that's why the Jews didn't do it, and that's why when Christianity came into the Roman Empire, where abortion and infanticide were rife and normal and accepted, in the first post-apostolic teaching of the Christian faith, the Didache, in 134 AD, it says that the killing of nascent life in the womb is murder most foul and is beyond the pale for anyone who would name the name of Christ.
Wow, beautifully said. All right, let me take a quick break. Dr. Richard Land's with us today. He's president of the Southern Evangelical Seminary, and one of the great apologetics seminars is coming up in October. You may want to check it out and attend. The best of the best will be there. You can go to ses.edu, ses.edu, and register. We'll be right back. Welcome back, and our special guest today is Dr. Richard Land. He's president of the Southern Evangelical Seminary, and just one of the great institutions. And let me encourage you to check it out at ses.edu. That's their website, ses.edu. And while you're there, check out the apologetics conference that they have coming up in October. The best of the best will be there, and believe me, you'll walk away changed. And again, that's ses.edu. Dr. Land, as a result of the World Magazine survey, it appears that the faith community is waking up to the importance of getting involved in the political system, which is, to me, encouraging, hopefully enough to make a difference. But help me out with what seems to be a conflict in some of the research that I see, and that is young people, are they interested in this? Or are they not interested in this? I'm seeing both sides of the story, and I'm talking young Christians. Are they interested in the political system, or do they see it as a complete waste of time?
Well, look, the younger evangelicals, the millennials, they're a different crowd. There's no question about that. The ones that I've met that are involved in the pro-life movement are more dedicated than anybody you can imagine. They go to protest marches. I've seen them, and they're holding up signs that say, I survived Roe, Roe won't survive us. And they are very much involved. But there's another group that is not involved or as involved, and who are I guess, jaded and perhaps very, they look upon the political system as something that won't make much difference. And I've heard this argument, and it just drives me to distraction. I've heard it from the pulpit. Younger pastors who say, well, evangelicals tried political involvement in the 1980s and it failed, and so, we don't need to do that again. Well, that is about as fallacious and specious an argument as you can make. Well, were evangelicals as successful as we wanted to be with involvement in the 1980s and the 1990s? No, we were not. But think about what would have happened had we not gotten involved. Ronald Reagan would not have been elected president in 1980 if it had not been for Jerry Falwell and the moral majority registering about 14 million evangelicals who weren't even registered to vote. Now, Ronald Reagan's election meant the end of the evil empire. If Jimmy Carter had been reelected, there's nothing that says that the Soviet Union couldn't have tottered on for a good while longer, causing misery in the world because it was the evil empire. We would have a Supreme Court that would be horrendously more liberal than the Supreme Court that we have today. It's just fallacious to say, well, here's the way things are, and it didn't make that much difference. You have to compare the way things would be if it had not been for Christians getting involved as salt and light and making a difference. Did it make as much difference as we had hoped? No. But it certainly made a difference, and it makes a difference today. Elections have consequences. And if any millennial doesn't believe that, then they haven't been watching the news for the last 6 years.
One of the elements that we battle in this whole issue is spiritual cynicism. Why bother? This is fulfilling Bible prophecy. All the signs are there, so why get involved? What's your response?
Well, my response is that, first of all, Jesus said, no man knows the hour or the day of his coming. So whether we're in the last days or not is beyond our purview and beyond our knowledge base. We don't know that. Secondly, Jesus commanded every disciple to be salt and light. He looked at a decaying world and he said to Christians, you're to be the salt of the earth. He saw a world that was in darkness and he said, you're to be the light of the world. And you're to let your light so shine before men that they will see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. So if we're going to follow the teachings of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 16, and his command for us to be salt and light, we don't have the option of withdrawing from the political system and from involvement with the world in which we live.
Dr. Land, it seems like we're heading to another conflict as a result of the Supreme Court now legislating from the bench the definition of marriage. And as you probably saw, the baker in Colorado, the upper court upheld the decision of the lower court, so he's found guilty. We have bakers, photographers not wanting to do these marriages, these weddings. Now we have judges, county clerks, and justice of the peace who are refusing to marry and issue licenses. We are moving into some kind of a legal conflict. A judge sitting on the bench refuses to do the marriage of a same-sex couple, now is being threatened to be disbarred. Where in his oath of office to uphold the law and make decisions on a case requires him to do weddings?
Well, of course, he's not required to do weddings. If he's a judge, that's an option. I know judges that are now saying we're not going to do weddings at all. If we have to do same-sex weddings, then we'll just get out of the wedding business. I think that to me, this is the weaponizing of government against its own citizens. This case of the baker in I think it's Oregon, and the case of wedding photographers in other states, this is scandalous. Now, do I think that public accommodation requires you to serve people no matter what their sexual orientation? Yes, I do. I believe that if a homosexual or a lesbian couple come in and they want a cake or they want some cookies, you ought to give them to them. You ought to sell them to them. But to ask a baker who is a Christian to take part in a gay wedding ceremony and to provide to decorate the cake and to provide that, for a photographer to provide the services at a wedding is a bridge too far. That is compelling them to violate their conscience. And it's not as if we're back in the 1950s or the 1960s in the South, where people were not able to get services. There are photographers and there are bakers in every community who would be willing to do this service. And so why single out Christians and try to compel them against their conscience under penalty of law to do that which is unconscionable. I believe they have a First Amendment right to not do these weddings and to not provide their services for same-sex weddings. And this is part of our Bill of Rights. And we need to stand up and defend them. And to defend, we're going to have to defend our rights by practicing them and using them. Otherwise, let's be very clear. The agenda of the radical gay community is not just tolerance, not just acceptance, but affirmation. They want to compel evangelical Christians to participate in their ceremonies and to take homosexual and lesbian behavior off the list of biblical sins.
Well, some have capitulated. Some are holding strong, so the lines are being drawn in the sand there. You make a great point, and I think that it behooves all of us who stand on the biblical definition of marriage that we're going to have to support these cases with our finances, whether it's to the law firm or to them individually, because this thing needs to be appealed as far as it can go.
Exactly right. And it brings us back to elections matter, because the judges are either elected or at the federal level, they are nominated by the President of the United States, and they are confirmed by the Senate. We vote for our president. We vote for the senators from our states. And if we don't like the judges, the way to change it is by electing better nominators and better confirmers. And it makes a difference. Let me give you an example. In 1940, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled 8-1 that Jehovah's Witnesses did not have the right to refuse for conscience sake to pledge allegiance to the flag. And if they refused to pledge allegiance, they were not allowed to go to public school. 3 years later, in 1943, the Supreme Court reversed itself. 3 years later, they reversed themselves with a 6-3 decision in the middle of World War II that said that Jehovah's Witnesses children did have the right to refuse for conscience sake to pledge allegiance to the flag. And the person who wrote the opinion, Justice Jackson, said it was the North Star in the constitutional constellation of America, freedom of conscience. Why the change? Because there were 3 new Supreme Court justices put on the bench between 1940 and 1943, and they shifted the court. There's nothing wrong with our Supreme Court that better presidents nominating better justices won't cure.
Well said. Last thought here. Alabama, Louisiana, and New Hampshire have decided to cut state tax-paying payers funding Planned Parenthood. But the President Obama, has now written them threatening letters to say that they're in violation of federal law. Wow, there's a conflict for you.
Well, we shouldn't be surprised. President Obama is the most liberal president in the history of the United States. I don't think that's an even contestable argument. In fact, he's probably the second most liberal person to ever live in the White House. Now, who's the most liberal person to ever live in the White House? I don't think there's any question that was Eleanor Roosevelt, who was far, far more liberal than her husband and far more liberal even than President Obama. But President Obama is clearly the most liberal president in the history of the country in terms of foreign policy, in terms of economic policy, and in terms of social policy.
All right, so we have a chance to replace him with somebody different. How do you? One last question, I'll let you go. How do you think this this whole thing with Trump and Fiorina and Carson? They're representing close to 50% of the vote, and they're outside the Beltway. That's certainly sending a message, don't you think?
Well, I think it is. You know, clearly in both the Democratic primary, where you've got a self-confessed socialist in the opponent of Mrs. Clinton, who is doing very, very well. In fact, he's leading her now in New Hampshire. And he may be a senator, but he's an anti-establishment figure. He's a socialist, an admitted socialist. And on the Republican side, as you say, you've got 3 people who are at the top of the polling, who are not politicians. Donald Trump is a businessman. Carly Fiorina is a businesswoman. And Dr. Carson has been a neurosurgeon. I think this tells us that the American people, left, right, and middle, are fed up with the political establishment. They're fed up with the ends doing that which is beneficial to the ends, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. And they are looking for people who are transparent, people who say what they think and say what they believe, and people who are outside the Beltway. And you'll notice also, if you count the governors in there, the people who are non-senators, you see an anti-Washington impulse that's even greater than if you just take the three that are not from the political class. But I think clearly these people have tapped into a very deep, sort of a visceral, gut-level rejection of business as usual. That the system is not working, and the people know it's not working for them and for their benefit and for their children's benefit. And you've got millions of Americans who, for the very first time in the history of the country, are concerned that their children and their grandchildren are going to have a lower standard of living than they had. My parents assumed that my brother and I were going to have a higher standard of living than they had had, just as they had a higher standard of living than their parents. I can't make that assumption about my children. I can't make that assumption about my grandchildren. And in my case, all three of my children, one has a doctorate and two have master's degrees, and I can't assume that they're going to have a higher standard of living than their mother and father had. There's something wrong with the system when that's the case.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Land. I know your time is precious. We value it greatly, and the partnership that we have with you being on the Dove TV network. Let me just say to our viewers and listeners, check it out. Their upcoming apologetics conference in October. You can go to ses.edu. Thank you, my friend. We'll talk to you again soon, okay?
Well, thank you. God bless.
God bless. We'll be right back.